Hello, everyone. This evening, our Radley Then and Now talk will focus on the history of the CCF at Radley. We will be travelling back into the turn of the century to uncover the beginnings of the college CCF in the 20th century and the important role that it played in preparing officers, especially during the First World War. We're going to hear about square bashing, boot polish, and arduous training, and memories of these are not always rosy. We'll also be hearing about the famous Slingsby grasshopper glider, which was known to take flight for up to 15 seconds before colliding with brambles, according to some young Radley pilots. Before we move on, just a few housekeeping items for you. Please keep your microphones on mute while you're on the call, just to prevent any disturbance during the talk. But this is an interactive event, so we encourage you to raise a hand or turn your microphone on and chip in if you want to make a comment or share a memory. There's also a chat function at the bottom of your screen, so if you would rather, you can pop a message down there. And just please note that we are recording the session. That's so that we can make it available later on to people who aren't able to join us today. So it will be on YouTube and on our website later. So I am delighted to have you all join us, and I'll now hand over to Clare, our archivist, to take up the talk. Thank you, Clare.
Hello, everybody. It's really nice to see you all this evening. Sophie's been gathering stories and memories about the CCF for several months now, and I hope that I've incorporated a number of those in a number of the photographs that have come through. One or two came through today and actually were things that we had not got really good photos of. So it's really wonderful to share so much with us. I'm going to talk about the history of the OTC, the Officers Training Corps, and how it morphs into the CCF. And as Sophie said, please chip in with your thoughts and memories, corrections, anything which expands on what I'm saying, because this is developing for us into a collection of oral histories. We do it informally like this, but it's actually a really valuable part of our archive and our collective memory. So I'm looking a little bit thematically, but obviously the easier thing to do with these is to go chronologically. So we're going to look at the history of the CCF as we start. And the beginnings actually go all the way back to William Sewell, because he was mostly concerned in 1860, as you will be aware, of the growing threat of Napoleon III. And he decided that Radley was going to defend the world against Napoleon III. So he tried to set up a little kind of equivalent of a yeomanry corps of his own. He had a number of antique, they go down in the records as rifles, but I can't believe they were rifles in 1860. But basically the fellows of the college said, we are not going to set up a military group in the school. But the weaponry that he collected hung around in the old gym for at least 20 years after 1860. So you could just imagine how this would work with health and safety today, that we've actually got a set of some form of musketry freely available in our gym. There were also a lot of arguments right at the very beginning there that said that the school, which basically had fewer than 200 boys, and we're trying to row, we're trying to play cricket, we haven't actually got room to support a cadet corps as well. And that was one of the real difficulties about establishing the Officers Training Corps and so on, because the school was just not big enough to support it at that time. But as we hit 1900, there are again calls. Other schools are beginning to set up officers training corps. They're beginning to work formally with the military. And there is a call that Radley should join in. And what happens under Warden Field is that a new Don called Arthur Davis arrived in the school. He had already been part of a cadet corps as a teacher while he was at Ellesmere College. He was attached to the King's Shropshire Light Infantry. And he oversaw the founding of Radley's Officers Training Corps. They began with a range, a 1906 range, which you see here, set up past College Pond. And that was then compulsory rifle shooting and shooting practice for all the boys in the school. So you've now got a point where, having said we can't have a corps separate to all of, alongside all of our sport, suddenly we're saying we can actually have all of the boys, becomes part of their education that they learn how to shoot. So that moves on into 1909, and the corps is founded. It's an officers' training corps. It immediately starts to join in with military things. It goes to, in 1910, we'll see a photograph in a moment of the camp at Aldershot. 1911 goes to Tidworth, and actually at Tidworth camp in 1911, Radley won the competition for tent putting up. So they were already good enough to beat everybody else in getting tents erected. 1910, they're here in Aldershot. And you can see here, Ernest Whitfeld, who's sitting in the corner at number 2 tent. Here he is. Alongside Macinnes and various other well-known Radley names, Bartram, Hoyle. And they're starting to learn all of the military things. You notice that they're wearing, they've got really heavy uniform, they're wearing puttees, which last actually until the 1940s. Very heavy canvas tents, all of this sort of thing. But where are they going? Here we are. This is Ernest Whitfeld, who came to E-Social in 1907. This is him in 1911. And here he is in 1916, serving with the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry on the Somme. So they went very, very quickly into war. One of the aspects of the OTC was that it gave them a fast track through officer training because they'd already done it. And we do have a number of them who actually go on to quite distinguished military careers. But it's also the cost that we have there is because they went to the trenches as junior officers. They were absolutely the front line. They were those who were, because they stood out, because of their uniform, because of their height, they had better nutrition than most of their men, so they were taller when they stood up in the trenches. All of those things made them the target for snipers. And of that cohort who came to Radley in 1909 and 1910, the death rate in World War I was 1 in 3. Nationally, it's 1 in 5 for those who served. But of those junior officers, particularly in that year, 1 in 3. So that is one of the really sobering thoughts that we have with that. But they were also participating in the war. We've got this, you can see the size of the cadet corps. Here are the cadets, all in their uniform. Here are the junior boys. And what they've got here are 2 ambulances, which the school raised the funds for, to send the ambulances to the front for the British Army in the field. They were very proud of the fact that they dedicated 2 of them to go. And that's part of their war effort. So between the wars, you would say, what happens next? Well, the main thing was that the Officers Training Corps was a very smart unit. So smart that the school actually built an armory in 1928, which many of you will remember in part as an armory in its own right, as a building, freestanding. But others, younger members, will know was built into the music school. It was just so we've got the music school there. The rest of the music school that came up with Dennis Silk, with the Silk Hall, the concert hall, and so on, kind of enfolded it. We have a rather weird thing happening at the moment, which is that the biggest building project on site is the new music school. And actually, the building of the 1980s and early 1990s has been stripped away, so that Merriman and Knapp Fisher's original building is now actually still, again, freestanding. You can actually stand on site and see this building. But I've always loved this juxtaposition of a music school with an armory. I assume it's really helpful to just shoot the bagpipers. I don't know. But also up in the attic, space was dedicated up there for the Natural History Society. So they kept their specimens up there, and the Natural History Society Museum. But they were a group, their commanders were men who had themselves come back from the trenches. They were military men. A lot of them had various medals, gallantry medals. A lot of them, such as A.K. Boyd, had the Military Cross. Nugee, who was a leader, had the officer commanding, also had the Military Cross. So they were being commanded and trained by people who really knew how the army worked and what was happening. So when we reach the Second World War, Radley was selected for propaganda purposes. There was a wonderful article which was put out of an officers training corps in action. So we have this fabulous collection of photographs. But the report of what they were like under Eason, this is the inspection report for 1946. So drill was very good, an outstanding unit. Saluting very good, arms and foot drill good, the march past very good, and cadets stood very still in the ranks. Weapon training very good, tactical training very good, full of interest. Technical training and signaling is very good. Cadets are interested and work well. Discipline, very good. So here they're digging out a section out on the pitches. We have tried, we did consider when we were doing the commemorations for World War I, we did talk to a school about whether they would let us dig trenches in the pitches, and the estates bursar and the groundsman weren't keen. I don't think the boys were either, but there was a suggestion we should do that. But here is what they're doing. Here is the non-commissioned officers tactics course in 1940, working with maps. Here is that signals course that they're talking about. The boys on the left are working with Morse lights and with a crystal radio, just sitting there learning that skill. And on the right, my right, with a crystal radio. I was visited a while back by someone who was evacuated to Radley from London at the age of 9 in about 1940. One of the things that he did was that he was being taught by one of the dons how to work with miniature crystal radios. Not this large one, but actually one would say spy level size radios. He was actually inspired enough by this to go into an electronics career of his own, and ended up in early computers. But I'd really like to know what that particular don was doing with very, very miniature crystal radios during the Second World War. So we move on, and the next thing that happens, of course, is national service and the Cold War. So this is John Firth, who we now have named on one of our war memorials, who went out to Korea It's 1944, a boy in F social. 1951, this is him at Sandhurst for officer training, and a copy of the telegram sent to his parents, telling that he had been killed in action in Korea. This is one of the things that I think when we're thinking about the OTC or with the CCF, we tend to forget that actually a lot of the time it was within a war footing. National service was a serious thing that people were going to go and do. And I'm sure a number of you will have done national service or be concerned about it. Is there anybody there who wants to speak up about that? No? And the Cold War, we tend to forget what goes on from 1947 all the way up until the fall of the Berlin Wall and in 1991. So we had this lovely quote from Flemming Jorgensen, who came to D Social in 1954, about, he came here from Denmark. He was talking about his, how training with the CCF actually led to him going to be a reserve officer throughout the Cold War. Here he is with his brother, the two of them, in Radley uniforms. And even in 1979, our CCF are doing their field training at an army base in Germany as part of that. So we've had all the way through, up until this point, we've had a sort of a background, which is that this is a serious matter. What skills are the boys learning and how are they using them? It's beyond a normal education to do this. But there are other aspects of it as well. We've got the band. This is the OTC band, the dedication of the War Memorial in 1922. They were clearly well respected and worked very well. CCF band in 1959, still there. And there have been quite a lot of calls recently, particularly with Tim Morris, who's the SUC Centre, that we should have the band back again and have military music and a military marching band. So we come to, I've already talked a little bit about inspection. This is way back when they're starting, 1913. So we've got Warden Selwyn, which is what dates this, just before the war. And just a very smart turnout. We come to 1924, and we've got in the centre here, Edward Prince of Wales, who came for the opening of the Wilson Library. And obviously, if you're going to open a library, you also need a full military detachment. So the band are here again. Warden Fox is there with him, and the commanding officers of 1924. But the inspection that most caught the school's imagination was in 1947, which was the centenary year of the school. And the person who came to do the inspection and to visit was Field Marshal Montgomery of Alamein. And here he is signing the drum. And again, one of those things that we've been hunting for all over school is what happened to that drum. But he gets the full whack. He's got here Dean Henderson from the council, who actually died a couple of months after this. The sub-warden, all of the military personnel, everybody comes out for Montgomery. And what he also did was to give a talk. You only see the boys in uniform here, apart from this one, there's a couple here who are wearing school caps. So it is to the whole school, but the majority of them would be in uniform at this point. And he lectured to them on Al Alamein. That blackboard that he lectured on, again, is something that has been hunted down, and it's now known to be in the Imperial War Museum. Somebody gathered it up and put it and saved it to put it there. So tactics about the battle from the man that worked out the battle itself. And then we come to some of the other things that happen. Well, the first is the shooting team. And they first won the shooting cup in 1912. I've always loved this photograph of all these umbrellas and this beautiful, beautiful lady who's standing here bravely with her umbrella down, Warden Field watching again. But that's the first time that Radley won the shooting cup. And then over here, we have the shooting team. This is the 1965 shooting team. And many of you, I'm sure, will remember RSM Howe. There was a great quote from him about about the size of his voice. Somebody did say to us that you could hear RSM Howe from here to Stamford Lock. We've also got some familiar names again. Stanger, Marshall Hellard, Stamford Tuck, Captain Johnson, and so on. So shooting has been a key part of it. And this goes right the way back to that shooting range that we saw right at the very beginning. And then it starts to become even more technical. Up until at least 1938, we were talking entirely about an officers' training corps, which is army-based. Radleians, from the beginning of flight, had been going in to work to fly for the Royal Flying Corps, which by 1918 had become the RAF. One of whom was the Reginald Marix of 1905, G Social, who became the first Air Vice Marshal ever as a flying ace. He brought his plane just to land on the pitches. And you can imagine what the school thought when that happened. Just plane flying straight in, landing on the pitch. So exciting that even in the 1970s, his feat for which he became an ace, which was to be the first person to destroy a Zeppelin in the air and actually on the ground as well, was still featured in the victory. But by 1940, we probably had the earliest air cadet force in the country. The official dates and all the records that I say only list it from 1941. This photograph we know dates from 1940. It was published in a magazine of 1940. And certainly some of the Dons who went on to work with the RAF were here 1938, 1939, including Barker, for whom the Barker Gym is named. So we've got a very early RAF. One of the key things that the boys were doing also during World War II was actually guarding those pitches. Because if you think about them, if you go back and look at how easy it is for Marix to come and land, the pitches of Radley were actually regarded as a target. A lot of them were ploughed up for crops, but that expanse of grass was something that had to be guarded day and night with constant patrols, keeping an eye that nothing was using it or using them to land.
Claire, there's a couple of comments
Yep.
which you might just want to know about. So
Yes.
just a couple of short ones, but there's someone has said that the drum and skin, or at least ones that were very similar, were upstairs at CCF when they arrived, but they're pretty sure they're not there now.
Mm-hmm.
And someone else has said that they heard from Gary Miller that some boys were still in puttees when he arrived as late as the 80s and 90s.
Still in puttees. They were supposed to have gone out of puttees with a whole new approach to the cadet corps from the army in the beginning of 1940. But if you look at this boy here in the RAF, he's clearly wearing puttees still. So, yeah.
We've also got a question, are those OTC air section training sections happening in the science department windows? Look like a clue.
I think it is, yes. Those very large windows that are down there in the, what would have been the new science block, which was opened in 1938. I think also you can see behind the instructor where he's at the blackboard, you can see what looked like some of the gas taps and a sink for a science lab. So yes, that's where they are. I should also say, if we go back a little, where we were looking at trenches, go back to where they're digging trenches. Here we are. One of the key things that Radley OTC did during the Second World War, obviously they've got guards out looking at the pitch. They were also working with the Abingdon Home Guard and with Eastbourne Cadet Corps when they were evacuated here to guard the Thames line. And there's a very good pamphlet by Tony Money, which describes the work of the Thames line, which is that basically after the fall of Dunkirk, the War Office established a series of lines of defense across the country in the case of an invasion. So as Germany moved up from the coast, they would meet a series of blockages. And the Thames line was one of the most crucial of these and one of the first of them. So as you go along the Thames, you see all of the pillboxes, which are still in place for the entire length of the Thames. And Radley, working with Eastbourne and with the Abingdon Home Guard, were guarding that particular line. So they were taking a serious role in that. Does anybody else have anything they wanted to bring out? If anybody remembers anybody that comes up in the photograph or any of these incidents I'm talking about, then please do speak up.
We've had a couple more comments about puttees and gators. So if anyone wants to unmute and share those, please do feel free.
Yes, please do tell us. Talk about it. What is that like? Steve?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. And definitely no putties in the 60s.
I can't.
We definitely did not use putties in the 60s.
So Steve was just saying there are definitely no putties in the 60s that he remembers.
Right.
Definitely not.
So none in the 60s. Well, that's good news. Stephen Carey?
Yep, I think that in the 1970s, we had black polished gaiters, which were kind of really tiresome. You had to spend ages polishing those. Those were in the 1970s, if you can hear me. Also, I think there were sweaters, which I suspect had been left over from the Second World War, which had a shoelace, rather curiously, around the neck to attach it with. So I think some of the stuff in the 70s may have been left over for maybe 20 or 30 years.
That's sounds like quite an interesting get-up. Poor Claire can't hear you for some reason, but that sounds like quite a thing to see. I don't suppose you have any photos that you'd be able to share with us from that period? This is what we're using just to make this work.
Fortunately not.
Shall we go back? Oh, that's a shame. We'd definitely like to see them.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So the laces and the jumpers, I take it that were around the neck. Is that correct?
Unmute myself first here. Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, that still happened. I mean, the jumpers haven't been. We still have jumpers, and the cadets don't wear jumpers now. But I certainly remember wearing jumpers when I was in the army, and the reason why we put string in the jumpers was because after a few washes the neck started sagging, so you would tie the string at the back to keep the neck up of the jumper. So it's not well, I'm sure the jumpers were quite old when you're in the CCF, but it did carry on. And the black putties, the polishing of the black putties, that probably goes. That's a green jacket thing, probably a 3rd Battalion thing where they wore black buttons, and most of their kit was black, and they tried to black the cap badge out, etc. So that may have came in then. And I do remember some boys telling me that when James Davis, not James Davis, who was before Gary Miller did have boys in putties, because boys have told me that before. Although I didn't find any when I got here. So.
Interesting, thanks.
There is a question, Claire, for you. Do you know who was the Radley officer with HRH Prince of Wales when the Radley detachment was inspected in 1924?
Yeah. I do have the record of it, but I don't have it to hand immediately at the moment. It's not a photograph that we have in the collection. It was one that was sent to Tony Money about 20 years ago as a copy, with just a covering letter. So we can check and find that out, but at the moment I don't have an answer to it. No. Actually, we will find out in a little while. Come to think of it. So if we push on, so we've got an Air Force which is starting. Now the question is, how do you train an Air Force? And this is one of the, this is the inspection for 1959 with the fly past of chipmunks. And we're very pleased because this photograph actually arrived this morning. I had 2 really, really bad photocopies of it, but not the original photograph. So this was sent by Richard Badbury this morning, with the story about how he was the pilot of the first aircraft flying low over the school. And this is the first recorded fly past by any cadets at any school. And also thinking in terms of how military it is, this also was a photograph that we were sent by Richard Bailey. Now, I know in the Chapel of the Resurrection over Memorial Arch, we do have a very small memorial to Hugh Spencer, but I had never seen this photograph of his Commonwealth War grave before in Norfolk. And that is really, I thought, very moving that he should have been honoured in that way, having been killed in a gliding accident on training camp when he was 17.
I remember him very clearly. He was in French with me.
Right? Would you like to talk about him, Steve?
I remember when it happened. It was rather strange. The next term, I was doing German with Dickers Way, and Dickers said he had a premonition about it, that something's going to happen. Something bad was going to happen at a summer camp. And it was really rather sad because he was a nice fellow, John Spencer. I told Sophie about it. I've written to her about it, so I think she's got all the info.
Yeah, I remember you did. Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So so his story has come from 2 places, but it was very good to have the photograph of the headstone and to add that into our war memorial databases. And this is the thing which has been exciting everybody since we heard about it. This is the Slingsby Grasshopper glider. So nobody can quite get their head around this. Does anybody remember actually flying this? Sophie did find a...
I never flew it, but I did man the massive bungee catapult at one time that launched it.
Okay, John, would you like to tell us more about this?
Well, I think I've written it down and sent it to Sophie as well, but it really was a massive version of a handheld catapult, but this bungee cord was probably a couple of inches in diameter, and two teams would march out ahead of the glider. I'm not quite sure how the glider was held back.
It was anchored onto a car.
A car, yeah, okay. But then the teams would split to form a sort of Y, so that when the glider was released from the car, it took off and flew over our heads.
I took it up a couple of times. No accidents that time.
Well, I think the thing that astonished me was that I found a letter which the UK Air Force headquarters had written to Tony Money in 1994 about the grasshopper gliders, because they were trying to find a photograph of one. They had no record of them. This photograph from the Radleian is the only one that we have. I know that one of the other schools has now actually found a piece of film of it, and you can go and hunt onto YouTube and find a Slingsby grasshopper glider being flown for all 15 seconds of it from one of the other schools.
I've also seen a video of one of them being launched, towed up with an aeroplane and released at some considerable height, and they really did fly quite well. Slightly reminiscent of a brick, but you could get down safely.
Well, today actually Sophie managed to find a photograph of one at an airfield, so they're still out there. Here it is.
Yeah. Okay. They were a German invention originally. The British version had a slightly different tail, but it was the same idea. There were a lot of Germans practicing here in Iceland just before the war in about 1937, and they practiced on things like this.
Right.
We have a few messages coming in saying we had the remnants of the glider in the late 80s and 90s. It did fly again at RAF Vista Flying Club before being donated to Berlin. And Andrew Wallace says John Wiley was in charge of the RAF section before taking over the naval section. He occasionally got the glider out to fly in the early 1980s.
Mm-hmm. I remember, Will, that the car that we used to anchor it with, in the very early days, around about 1961, I think it was, there was an old green Ford van that the car club got hold of, and they stripped it down and put it together again, and then they stripped it down again, and then they lost some of the bits and they couldn't fit the body on again, so the car was basically just a chassis with a couple of seats and a starter, and we used to drive it around the pitches, joyriding. And then one day I remember a couple of chaps broke into the shed where it was kept at the back of the armory, and went driving on their own without permission from anyone. And they got caught and stopped, and they had a very nasty conversation with the warden. So that was that. Does anyone remember the assault course in the woods at the end of the pitches? Anyone?
very vaguely, Steve. I think the cross-country run course sort of went through there, and I remember seeing some of the obstacles
Yes, I
of
remember,
that assault
I
course.
remember there was a long pit full of muddy water, and you had to get the end of a rope and swing over it. And if you didn't swing fast enough, you fell into the muddy water. And that means polishing everything all again.
Right. Well, I think the thing where Andrew Wallace, you've said that John Wiley was instrumental in getting this back out again. And certainly my imagination when I first heard about it was surely John must have invented this, which is one of the reasons why I was quite startled to discover that it actually came from the Air Force itself. It's not one of our madder Radley inventions. But we move then on to the Navy. And as you say, John Wiley particularly ran the Air Force right the way through the 1970s into the early 80s because it was Rickards who was running the Navy. And the Sea Cadets were founded in 1943. So by this is the point at which our CCF, our Officers Training Corps, has now become the Joint Training Corps, because we've now got all three branches of the military by 1943. So we have the Army still, the Air Force, and now the Navy have come with the to join the cadets. And the question that came in today from Richard Roberts was this quotation about the Master in Charge of Section in the 1950s, who he said we subsequently learned had won the George Cross. Now, I had a look through the registers this morning to see who, because I had no idea we had somebody with such a gallantry award. But we do have Christopher Ellis, who I know was very much involved in sailing and with the Navy and so on. And he certainly has GM after his name, so he had the George Medal. Haven't yet been able to find out what he won the George Medal for. But it does make you pause again with this question of the dons who are teaching these courses and taking the CCF and how what a military background they have. Because when we come into the 1950s, again, the dons who come back from the Second World War, we've got people like Peter Way, who has the Military Cross. We have Tony Money, who won the Military Cross in Libya, and so on. And they're the people who are helping with the CCF. So it's now become, from 1943 onwards, the Joint Training Corps, and then from 1946 or thereabouts, it becomes the Combined Cadet Force, the CCF. And we have very few sailing photos from before the 1970s and 80s. These I can't date. Obviously, we've got a Royal Navy helicopter. We've got here John Wiley, and I think it was Richard Pollard was talking to me about John the other day. Richard, unfortunately, has gone on holiday to Cyprus this week, so he couldn't join us today. Otherwise, he wanted to be part of this. And telling me about how John Wiley, as an RAF commander, was all bristling moustache. And then when he took on the Navy, he went for the full set. So that's him. I've no idea who this is in front of him. Does anybody know? Okay. So here is our list of officers in command. So the one who was there with the Prince of Wales was probably Francis Nugee, since he was in command from 1923 to 28. So we've got Davis, Stevenson, Nugee, Boyd, and Eason. Ranulph Way, who took over briefly in 1941 and then came back again in the 60s, which many people will remember. Gardner, who ran both Radley and Eastbourne. And then after that, the run of Anderson, Leicester, Peter Way, Ranulph Way, Treglown, Pollard, Pullen, Tim Morris, who handed over recently, within the last couple of years, to Paul Fernandez. And the photographs that we've got, this is one of our earliest photographs of the actual OTC before 1914 or in 1914. And the key thing about them is that they're wearing white bands around their hats, which shows that they have all qualified to go on to officer training. And the lower photograph is actually Eastbourne, again, a marching band, and they're marching through Abingdon. So the two cadet corps, as all things when Eastbourne were evacuated here, remained separate entities, but worked very closely together. So who are these commanding officers? Well, this wonderful solid silver tray was presented to Francis Nugee by what must have been his NCOs. Just looking through all the names inscribed on this, I was sent this about a month ago by the Nugee family because they wanted to know, could I identify the names on the tray? And this is when he left in 1928. So we've got some familiar, again, Radley names, Arkle, Balding, and so on, but quite an astonishing gift for the boys to club together and give him. This is Eason leading his troops across the Downs in the 1930s. And again, they've got those white bands indicating, I guess, indicating that they've qualified. Anderson with the Camp Guard in 1952, and RSM Howe. So these are all very much military, and thinking about a lot of, you look at Eason and his troop there, putties again, very smart turnout, and so on. But we've now reached the point where we're coming into, that's Ranulph Way, taking over back again in 1967 with RSM Howe. And then we come to now. One of the issues that came up about women teaching at Radley was how could they participate in all of the things that the school does? How could they couldn't play rugby, could they be in the boarding houses? And here we have what I think are two of the earliest female dons as officers. So we've got Liesl Benson in the Navy there, and Emma Rye, who was the deputy librarian in the Army. Emma certainly went on to join the TA, and she, going through Radley CCF, she went on to take on a territorial army service abroad. She served in Iraq for a while on the strength of having been here in Radley CCF. Obviously, we've got Wiley, Gary Miller, who we're talking about, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Pollard. Richard, I say, couldn't be with us today, but he did say, as he always says, I can't believe I did 38 years as commander of that CCF corps. He rose to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, which is the highest rank of any cadet commander in the country. Tim Morris, who later took over from him in the back there. and Mick Wright, who is on the call today. Mick, are you there? Would you like to talk about your time in the in CCF as squadron leader?
It was very entertaining. So, can you hear me? Yeah. No, there was a huge amount of fun. We had lots of highlights, often revolving around John Wiley, actually. I do remember one of my favourite moments was when I was on my training course to become an officer at RAF Newton. And I hadn't been issued my uniform properly, so I borrowed uniform basically from the CCF. And I didn't have my RAF cap badge, my cap at all. Now, John, having been in the RAF, had a cap that looked as if it came from World War II, and it was straight from the Luftwaffe. So I arrived on my training course in sort of cadet uniform that had been worn by a few cadets, and an officer's cap that was actually wonderful, but everybody else had really flat, unworn caps. And it was really quite amusing. Then I was sent to get my hair cut on the first day because my hair was too long. And I learned how to salute because I was walking along. And of course, at RAF Newton, it was a training camp. And all the soldiers were often practicing marching. And on the way down to the barbers, I realized what saluting actually was. So it helped me a great deal. But the RAF section was great. I took over from a guy called David Andrews, who built the hovercraft. And we kept that going for years and years and years. We used to fly at RAF Abingdon and RAF Benson. And initially we went up in Chipmunks. And one of the funniest sights was seeing a cadet in the back seat of a Chipmunk, and actually all you'd see was the top of their helmet because they were too short to actually see out the aircraft. But they also had a board, I think it was at RAF Abingdon in those days, and it was the pilots who were sicked on by cadets from the back seat. And the pilot that was leading this was a guy that was straight and level flight, projectile vomit down the back of his neck. So I think I felt sorry for the guys who took the cadets up because they weren't always terribly good at flying. I could go on and on and on and on, but I'm not going to because it's not about the RO section. But it was a huge opportunity. I ran it for about 20 odd years. The biology department basically ran the CCF because you had Richard Pollard, we had Paul Fernandez, we had Simon Thorne, we had myself, and at one point all three sections were run from the biology department. So we're to blame for a lot, I think.
Well, please chip in and keep on telling us. This is what this is about. Is just talking about your memories.
Do you want me to carry on? I can.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to interrupt at this point.
Right.
Who's that?
Yeah, Ian Yorston. So I did CCF for about 10 years, I should think, having come out of the RAF. So I'd had a military career in the RAF. And so I found the CCF quite hard because it was all a bit, CCF-ish, having been in the Royal Air Force. But Mick will remember that we did a camp, I think it was up at Lucas, which we took boys all the way up to the top of Scotland by train, as I recall, and persuaded them all to read books on the way up on the train. And Mick and I must have done about, I don't know, 7 or 8 camps together, I should think. And we quite often, because we were CCF officers, got put into fairly low-level accommodations, sort of treated very much as second-class officers, which I always thought was quite funny, of course, because I'd been in the Royal Air Force, so it was always funny to arrive on an RAF station. And we were put into a room sharing at one point, and you used to be able to leave your shoes outside the room in order to get them polished by the batting staff, which was something that by the 1990s and the 2000s was beginning to go out of fashion. But it turned out I didn't need batting staff, because when I woke up one morning, and those who know me will know that I always woke up late and was invariably late to everything. I woke up to discover that my shoes had been beautifully polished, which was a massive surprise to me until I discovered that Mick had mistaken his shoes for mine, had polished my shoes thinking they were his, and had then discovered that he needed to polish his as well.
Yeah, it just goes to show that senior officers looked after their junior officers incredibly well.
Incredibly well, and boy was I hugely grateful for the amount of fun that we had. I also remember John Harris being a really strong supporter of the outward bound activities. I don't think John Harris was ever in the CCF, but he ran all of the sort of outward bound and the Brecon stuff, and he was a past master at putting up tents and bringing them down again. And more importantly, he was an absolute past master at cooking amazing meals for those who'd gone to support CCF camps in Wales and the Lake District.
I think John deserves mentioning. He was the senior chef without any doubt whatsoever. It took me about 10 years to become sous chef, and Chris Bedford probably even longer to become chef number 3. But we used to pride ourselves in what we could produce in the middle of the Lake District or Snowdonia or the Brecon Beacons. But John was absolutely superb.
I remember the Brecon Beacons, there was also a pub reasonably nearby that the officers could all escape to as long as one officer remained on the camp.
Well, where we're going now is to that kind of new thing, and we come to the legend who is Jeff Traglown, who took over the CCF in 1968. And this is what he wrote about it. He wrote a detailed account of his time as contingent commander. When I took over in July 1968, the CCF was one of the traditional areas of trouble in the college, and justifiably so. While a few did in fact get much out of it, for many it was a complete and utter waste of time, most of which was spent doing nothing but standing about. No doubt it had standards to set and traditions to maintain, but they needed to be presented in a challenging way and not in the manner of the 1930s. Possibly correct then, but not in the 70s. So he introduced Wednesday options, and he also introduced expeditions. And one of the first, before he took over the contingents, was the first trip to Iceland, working with the Natural History Museum, looking at the pink-footed goose. And you've got this is one where he's taking David Hardy, who many people remember, John Gamage, who was speaking earlier, you were there, Richard Padfield, Jeff Traglown, Tony Taylor, Simon Pepper, and the minor route that they're taking here. So 1969 Iceland, 66 in Iceland, 69 in Iceland, 71, I think, in Greenland. So this combination of CCF introducing science, activities, and so on. This is the road and various hot springs in the 1969 expedition. And that leads on to the kind of things that you're doing. Yes, they had trips to the Brecons, to Snowdonia. I particularly like one where they started with a group in the north of Snowdonia and a group in the south of Snowdonia. And with maps, they were supposed to meet up in the middle. I presume they did. I've got Jeff's maps that show it, and the conditions under which they're working and climbing. So it moved into this much more, much less military and much more adventure activity training type of thing. But conditions could be really quite something. Now, personally, I hate camping, and I don't think I would ever have actually lived if I'd done this sort of thing. Team photos in the mist and so on. Does anybody remember these kind of expeditions under Jeff Traglown?
Yes. Well, it was more in the 1970s. And I was just thinking back to, we were discussing kind of food and cooking and all this kind of thing a little bit earlier, about the way it is cooked. A Primus stove was the thing we used, which was powered by kerosene, I believe, or paraffin perhaps. So you had to vaporize the paraffin, which seemed to flavor the food. It tasted absolutely vile. So you had this kind of flavor of paraffin, and attempting to cook, if I recall rightly, bacon roll out of a tin, some sort of tin stuff, which is semi-disgusting and fatty. Various sachets of things which are quite nice, some of them. And I think we've been allocated to climb Penny Ghent, I think, which I think could be in the Peak District. And the rather cleverer people found a route around that didn't involve climbing a waterfall, but I was less kind of streetwise in those days. And I had to do this ascent to this terrible waterfall, which eventually I did with a bit of help. But you know, some of those memories from probably about 1975 stick. But the memory of trying to cook some of this stuff and get this stove to light in the rain certainly stick. And presumably the way food is cooked, you know, rations, you know, without centrally being cooked, has evolved over the years. You know, see, I don't know how the Primus stove vaporizing paraffin, presumably maybe, I don't know, started in the 60s perhaps. You know, when did that then evolve and change into, presumably now use, I don't know, jet boils and these sort of things, or blocks of ketamine or whatever it is. So presumably that has all kind of shifted as well. But some of the kit was, I think, quite kind of basic. I think we were put into a fairly dilapidated army camp, staying in more or less like kind of stables on our beds in a big sort of barn, essentially. So it is fairly basic. Looking back on it, you know, one can look back nostalgically at a lot of this, but you know, I think presumably things have changed, and also what I suspect has changed is the kind of risk appetite. You know, presumably people are much more cautious now. You know, some of the things we were allowed to do in the 1970s, you know, presumably that has all kind of changed. You know, with a greater emphasis on health and safety. So times change, but the kind of memories stick. Thanks.
Well, in terms of health and safety, I was astonished by this photograph of actually ascending this ridge. There's clearly absolutely no safety equipment at all. So yes.
In many of our corps camps, I left in about 2012. We were still using paraffin stoves to cook for the officers. At that time. By then, however, the cadets were not using paraffin. That had advanced a little bit, and they had two-man tents and so on and so forth. So it was a bit more civilized. But you're right, health and safety was creeping in and creeping in and creeping in. Sometimes for the good, sometimes maybe, I'm not too sure. But the officers were still poisoning themselves on paraffin until I left, certainly.
Was there also a change in attitude among the boys?
Oh, good question. I think, yes, there must have been. Yes, there was. The military was less attractive. There was changes in the school as well. So you had competition from the DAV, you had competition with other activities. That there were arguments that emerged every now and then. Well, CCF shouldn't be compulsory. It should be voluntary. But somehow Radley still stuck with it, which I'm really quite pleased with. So there's always been that debate, I think. I mean, once the war years were over and it became a lot more peaceful, maybe it's going to change now. I don't know. But yeah, there was always that debate. I don't really want to dress up in uniform. I don't want to do drill. But there again, I think most cadets have never wanted to do drill.
I think the CCF was never compulsory, was it?
Yes.
Everyone took part, but I think it was not compulsory.
While I was there, as removes, you had to do CCF.
Yes.
Yeah, so did we. We had to do 4 terms in the Army section, yeah. or possibly the Navy and RAF might have been longer than that, possibly, if you chose that.
No, it's 4 terms, and then it was voluntary afterwards if you wanted to stay on as an NCO.
Okay.
No, I don't know what it is now.
I think there was 6 terms for either the RAF or the Navy at one point. It was one of the things that Jeff Treglown introduced, was
I'm talking
confining it.
Long before Jeff Treglown took over. I started at Radley in the 60s, 61 I think it was, and we were told that it was not compulsory, but and there were 1 or 2 conchies, but really everyone took part because it was fun. Mm-hmm.
Well, in terms of the responses from the boys, one of the things I have in a box, which is now marked sensitive, confidential, names are redacted, are the personal reports written by the officers about boys. And some of them are really quite helpful. So we have, cheerily did his bit, but happy to let others volunteer. Disorganized as usual, but had a go when he eventually got there. When cornered, got on with the job cheerfully. Did his bit in his usual grumpy way. Did his best. Silently did his bit when told to. And I think the worst, wouldn't have known he was there.
Can I ask, how far back do you keep reports on the pupils, the boys' reports? Because it'd be quite interesting to compare them to people who achieved great kind of military fame later on and became, 3 stars and 4 stars and all the rest of it, and see what their reports were like back, 40 years before. That would be actually fascinating.
It depends. I mean, this is actually where I've gone now, which is with the future careers. So here in 1959, we've got R.L. Grist, who became Major General Robin Grist, head of the Gloucesters, and Hayman Joyce, Lieutenant General Sir Robert Hayman Joyce, Commander JMD Curtis, RNR. So these are cadets from the 1950s, 1959, particularly this inspection, who did go on to great things in the military. But comparing what was said about them on camp with their later career, I present you with this one. Mostly disappointing, dour and despondent, did not enjoy camp, but good reports on his efforts on big walks on the first 2 days when the weather was good. That is the report we have on Dougie Dalyell, Military Cross, killed in Afghanistan, 1910. So yes, comparing them becomes more interesting. Now we have a lot of things that have come through on chat, I think.
Yeah, there's a terrifying recollection here from Nigel Anderton, who says, I recall going to Scotland somewhere near Stirling on an expedition, maybe in 1970. The Primus stoves were dangerous. One of our number was badly burnt lighting the stove in the door of the tent, and he was trapped in the tent whilst it was set alight. I can't imagine much worse than that.
I've reached the end of what I was planning to say, so it's over to anybody else. We still have a number of...
I would say some of the stars of CCF were always the cadets, because they would inevitably surprise you. And certainly talking about the RAF section, we had Ed Butterworth, who went on to the Army Air Corps, and a few others went on to the RAF and so on and so forth.
Ed Butterworth, you may not know, is now Colonel commanding the Army Air Corps.
So he's done reasonably well.
Yes.
Yeah. But I do remember being very cautious about believing what cadets said. Richard Pollard was very keen on making sure the officers and staff were fairly well trained to actually go on outward bound and go to the Lake District. So we'd all do our mountain leadership course. Even if we didn't finish it, we'd at least do the training. And I remember taking a group up Striding Edge, Helvellyn, and I said to all the cadets beforehand, are you all okay with this? It's fine, it's okay, it's a bit of a climb, and they all said, absolutely, no problem at all, perfect. Halfway up, which is the worst possible place, one of them said, sir, I'm scared of heights, I really want to go back down. And it was a case of, well, you can't go back down because that's far more difficult than going up. So I had to dog lead him, and we had a couple of other cadets. The boys look after the boys incredibly well. And we actually got him to the top. And when he got to the top, he just looked around. Luckily, it was a clear day and he had a wonderful view. And he just said, wow, oh, this was really worth it. Thank you. And it's little moments like that that you realize that what you did in CCF for lots of the cadets was well worth it. So the cadets were always the surprise. They were the fun. They were the irritating and wonderful people. And we must never forget that, I think.
Thank you, Mick.
I'll go away now.
Thank you, Mick Wright, speaking to us from Gozo.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. So it's been really nice to have you with us, Nick. Any other of the chat which we should pick up? Sophie, Caroline?
Just acknowledging Lord Craig of Radley. As obviously
Yes.
someone who had an amazing military career. I think mostly just a little notes here and there from people talking about expeditions more than anything.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And Clara, thank you to you for putting this together.
Thank you. The next one will be about life in the 1960s. So we do these regularly. So it's always good to spend time on this and to hear people's memories. Always something different and unexpected.
Yeah, thank you, Claire.
A quick question.
Yep.
I just wondered, we saw a photograph showing RSM Howe
Yes.
a few moments ago, and I was intrigued by the date. He'd obviously been there for quite some time.
Yes.
Have you got his sort of outside dates that he was RSM? Because he was RSM when I was there, and I remember, you know, one thing most of the boys did respect, even if they didn't like CCF, they respected the RSM because they knew that, you know, he had fought in the war. So did he come to the CCF immediately after the war?
I think he must have done, but I don't have I don't have quick and easy access to the records of the RSMs.
Yeah.
Even the contingent commanders and who is actually taking the different sections is not easy to find. It's one of those things you have to sort of tease out from the reports.
Leo has just popped onto the chat 1945 to 69. So
Right.
we may have an answer there.
Right. So is Leo telling me that he's got this up on the wall in the armory? Right.
Yeah, there is an RSM board in the CCF, and I've just been to check that, and I'm sure those were the dates. But yeah, 1945 to 69.
That's brilliant. We
That's
can add that
fantastic.
in. Thank you, Leo.
Long haul.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much. He was a great guy, actually. Really great guy.
Very nice man. I remember him clearly.
Yeah.
Have your guts forgotten, my bloody son?
He came into his own on the range days when we went to places like Mere Range for live firing with 303s. And he really came into his own.
We might have to wrap it up there. We have overrun, sadly, but you've all shown amazing grit to make it through, despite the fact that we've overrun. And there are some familiar faces on the screen for me, so I know some of you are zooming in from Iceland and America. So thank you all so much for joining us and chipping in and telling us all of these amazing stories. The next Radley Then and Now event will focus on the 1960s, as Claire mentioned, so please do get in touch if you have things to share with us about that as we start to pull that event together. It will take place in February, so keep an eye on our emails and communications to find out the date once we confirm that. But thank you, Claire, so much for all the research you did and the amazing talk, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Enjoy the rest of your evenings. Thank you. I love the salute there. I saw a couple of salutes there, which is fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Bye.